In a quiet corner of the African plains, nestled between towering forests and rolling hills, lay a village where the whispers of the wind seemed to carry stories of old. The villagers, accustomed to the gentle sway of the trees and the rustling of leaves, often said that nature itself spoke to those who listened carefully. In the mornings, mist would rise from the riverbanks, curling like soft fingers across the village pathways. Children ran barefoot over the dewy grass, their laughter ringing through the air like chimes, and the occasional call of a hornbill or a distant drum added rhythm to the serene mornings. Life in the village was simple yet vibrant, and every family held stories, rituals, and objects that connected them to their ancestors. Among these households lived a young girl named Lila, whose world seemed brighter than most because of the invisible magic she carried in her heart. Lila was a cheerful child, her eyes always sparkling with curiosity and wonder. She had the rare gift of imagination, turning even the simplest moments into grand adventures. But more than anything else, she treasured her doll, a small, lovingly crafted companion who had been with her since she could remember. The doll had beads for eyes that shimmered in the sun, a tiny dress embroidered with care, and little charms sewn into its fabric, which Lila believed held protection and wisdom. To her, the doll was not just a toy, it was a confidant, a friend, a keeper of secrets, and a partner in the countless games and stories she created. Lila would whisper to the doll late at night, confide her smallest fears and her grandest dreams, and in return she imagined the doll offering silent, understanding companionship. Every morning, before the sun had fully kissed the village with light, Lila would arrange the doll in her small wooden bed beside hers, speaking softly so as not to wake the household, as if ensuring the doll felt safe and loved. Yet Lila's father, Oba, did not share in his daughter's enchantment. He was a strict man, tall and imposing, with a voice that carried the weight of authority and expectations. His hands, calloused from years of labor in the fields and the forest, seemed ill-suited to gentle gestures, and his heart, while loving in its own way, was often clouded with fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of disobedience, and most of all, fear of superstition. Oba had grown up believing that spirits could dwell in objects, that misfortune could follow the careless, and that children's whims, if indulged too much, could invite calamity. The village had whispered similar warnings in his ears for years, tales of cursed objects and mischievous spirits that took delight in troubling households. So, when he saw Lila with her doll, talking to it, laughing with it, and treating it as though it were alive, a cold unease settled in his chest. He did not understand the bond, nor did he want to. To him, it was a dangerous attachment, one that could invite unnecessary complications, spirits, or even shame. The tension between Lila and her father grew subtly but surely. While she adored her doll and saw it as a source of comfort and creativity, Oba saw only frivolity and danger. He would scold her gently at first, telling her to stop speaking to empty things, or to focus on more practical pursuits. When his warnings were ignored, his tone hardened, and the shadows of fear and disapproval crept into their home. Lila, in turn, learned to keep some of her joy and imagination secret, cherishing her doll quietly, away from her father's watchful eyes. She would hide the doll beneath her blanket at night or slip it into her bag when visiting friends. Despite these measures, her laughter and playful spirit often drew the attention of neighbors, some of whom shared Oba's suspicions about the doll. Whispers spread through the village, carried by curious ears and wagging tongues, about how objects of pure love sometimes carried spirits or messages, omens of protection or warnings of justice. Even as a young girl, Lila could feel the weight of these murmurs. The forest seemed to watch her, the wind through the trees carrying faint voices that only she could perceive. Birds would occasionally linger nearby, their calls strangely comforting, as if acknowledging her secret companion. Flowers along her path seemed to bend slightly toward her, as though paying respect to the bond she shared with her doll. Lila began to sense that the doll was more than a simple toy. It was alive in ways beyond the understanding of adults, capable of witnessing the world with her, perhaps even of responding to her feelings in subtle, unseen ways. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of shadow in the corner of her eye, felt like a gentle reminder that she was never truly alone. The villagers, however, remained skeptical, their minds shaped by cautionary tales and old fears. Mothers would whisper to their daughters not to grow too attached to dolls or charms, warning that spirits sometimes lingered in objects of innocence, and that these spirits could act in ways that humans could neither predict nor control. Oba's own friends and relatives urged him to remove the doll, to assert control over Lila and protect the household from potential misfortune. Yet even in the face of these warnings, Lila's heart remained pure, and her love for the doll unwavering. Something deep within her told her that the doll was a friend, a protector, and a symbol of the innocence and joy that should never be punished or hidden. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the village, the stage was set for an unfolding story of wonder, defiance, and the unseen power of love. The villagers' whispers grew louder, the wind carried secrets through the forests, and the bond between Lila and her doll prepared to be tested. For in a world where fear often outweighed understanding, even the smallest heart, guided by affection and courage, could awaken magic in ways that no one, not even a strict father or skeptical villagers, could have imagined. Lila's doll was more than an object. It was a companion whose presence filled every corner of her small world. She named it Amari, a name she had chosen because it meant strength, in an old tongue her grandmother once spoke of. Each night, before the village settled into complete quiet, Lila would take Amari from its place beside her pillow and begin their nightly conversations. She spoke to it in whispers, telling it of her day, of the games she had played with other children, the songs she had heard drifting from the elders' huts, and the little wonders she had discovered in the forest. Amari of course never spoke back, at least not in words. Yet to Lila, the doll's silent gaze, the slight tilt of its head, and the way its tiny hands rested in her lap conveyed understanding, comfort, and encouragement. It was a language of the heart, a connection that needed no voice, and it wrapped around Lila like a protective cloak. When storms rolled across the plains, Lila clutched Amari close, feeling the warmth and reassurance of its tiny body pressed against hers. She imagined that the beads that served as the doll's eyes could see the winds coming, that the stitched mouth could call upon the spirits to shield her from the lightning, and that the charms sewn into its dress carried the blessings of her ancestors. On nights when thunder rumbled and rain splashed against the thatched roofs of the village huts, Lila would sit by the small window of her room, holding Amari tightly, whispering prayers and songs she had learned from her mother and grandmother. To Lila, Amari was a guardian, a steadfast ally against the uncertainties of the world outside, a beacon of calm in the chaos of the storm. She would often imagine themselves on adventures together. Journeys to faraway lands hidden in the folds of her imagination, where the forests were endless, rivers glowed with silver light, and animals spoke in secret languages only the pure-hearted could understand. The craftsmanship of Amari was exquisite. Each bead for its eyes seemed to capture sunlight, reflecting tiny specks of gold and green that danced when moved. The little dress it wore was embroidered with patterns of flowers and vines, threads looping intricately in reds, blues, and yellows that seemed almost alive. Tiny charms were sewn discreetly into the hems, small pieces of bone and wood polished smooth, imbued with meaning that Lila's mother had explained in hushed tones: protection, courage, love. Every detail was deliberate, designed to carry blessings and safeguard the child who cherished it. Lila often traced her fingers over the beads, over the threads of the dress, whispering thanks to the makers and the spirits she believed resided within it. The doll was not only her confidant but also a living heirloom, a link to her family's past, their wisdom, and their care. Yet, as Lila's bond with Amari deepened, her father's displeasure grew in equal measure. Oba watched the child speak to the doll, laugh with it, and depend on it for comfort, and a creeping unease settled over his heart. To him, the doll was a distraction, an unnecessary indulgence that could prevent Lila from learning her duties and from facing the practical realities of life. He feared that such attachments could invite misfortune, superstition, or even the wrath of unseen spirits. Oba's mind often turned to the stories he had heard as a boy, tales of children who had grown too attached to enchanted objects, of families haunted by inanimate companions, of lessons taught too late by mysterious forces. With each passing day, his disapproval became more pronounced. He would frown as Lila played with Amari, tighten his jaw when she carried it outside with her, and even suggest that she focus on chores rather than imaginary adventures. Lila, aware of her father's growing irritation, became more protective of her doll. She would hide it under her blanket during meals, tuck it into her satchel when she went to fetch water from the well, and whisper reassurances to it at night. But Oba's warnings, though stern, could not sever the bond between Lila and Amari. The girl's heart was steadfast, her belief in the doll unshaken by scolding or superstition. She felt instinctively that Amari was a source of strength, a friend that could not be taken from her by anger or fear. The villagers themselves noticed the peculiar devotion. Some smiled and nodded knowingly, recalling the old tales of objects that carried spirits of protection, while others whispered caution, warning of the dangers of indulgence and the unseen powers that could reside in seemingly innocent toys. Lila's mother had once told her that love and care could awaken dormant magic, that the purity of a child's heart could call forth blessings from ancestors. Now, as the whispers circulated, It seemed that Lila's devotion was no longer private, that her connection with Amari was being observed, judged, and speculated upon. Oba's fear and disapproval, the village's quiet murmurs, and Lila's unwavering love for her doll set the stage for the events that would soon unfold. For a bond as pure and steadfast as the one between Lila and Amari was rarely without consequence. It carried with it power, mystery, and a challenge to the beliefs of those who could not see with the heart. The air around the hut seemed charged with expectation, as if the forest and winds themselves sensed the growing tension between a father, his daughter, and a doll whose spirit was not so easily bound. And so, in that quiet African village, with its whispering winds, rustling leaves, and sun-dappled pathways, Lila held her doll close each night, unaware that the strength of her attachment would soon awaken forces both unseen and unforgettable. The world outside her small room, her father's stern gaze, the cautious whispers of the villagers and the shadows of superstition, was preparing to clash with the unwavering innocence and power of a child's love. In her hands, Amari was safe, radiant, and alive, a silent witness to the story that was only just beginning. Oba's frustration with Lila's attachment to her doll had been growing for weeks, each passing day intensifying his sense of urgency to assert control over the household. He had watched her speak to Amari as though it were alive, whispering secrets and sharing her smallest joys, and each act seemed to him a challenge to his authority and reason. To Oba, the doll was more than a toy, it was a symbol of distraction, of childish indulgence that could corrupt Lila's mind and heart. He feared the whispers of the villagers and the ancient warnings he had grown up hearing, tales of objects imbued with spirit that could haunt or mislead the unwary. The weight of responsibility of protecting his daughter and maintaining order pressed heavily upon him. And so, in the twilight of a tense afternoon, when the wind carried the scent of earth and distant rain, he made a decision he believed necessary. The doll must be removed, and in such a way that its influence could never return. Oba called Lila to the yard, his voice sharp and unyielding, carrying the authority that the child had come to both respect and fear. Lila approached hesitantly, her small hands clasped tightly over the folds of her dress, her eyes wide and bright with innocence. She clutched Amari to her chest, the beads of its eyes glimmering faintly in the fading sunlight. "Father, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It is just a doll. It does not hurt anyone. Please do not take it away." But Oba's face was set, the lines of his worry and stubbornness etched deep across his brow. He shook his head, sighing as though carrying the weight of a world only he could see. "Lila," he said firmly, "you must learn that some things are not for play. Some things bring danger when held too long, and some attachments must be tested or removed for the safety of the household. This doll, this Amari, cannot stay." Tears welled in Lila's eyes, but she remained silent, knowing that pleading further might only harden her father's resolve. Oba took the doll gently, almost reverently despite his determination, acknowledging that it had been a cherished companion, a creation of love and care. Then, with a firm nod, he gathered the tools necessary for what he intended: a spade for digging, a cloth to carry the doll, and a small bundle of herbs that he whispered over, a ritual gesture to protect her from harm, even as he separated her from her beloved friend. The hole he dug was deep and wide, its edges rough and uneven, the earth dark and damp beneath the waning light. The shadows of the forest stretched long across the clearing, trees bending slightly with the gentle evening breeze, as if they too were curious observers of the unfolding scene. Birds had fallen silent, their usual evening songs hushed, and the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth seemed to hold a cautious stillness. Lila followed each movement, her small feet shuffling in the dirt, her tears falling freely. She reached for the doll one last time, feeling its familiar weight, the softness of its stitched dress, and the reassuring gaze of its bead eyes. "Please," she whispered again, "don't bury it. Please don't take it away from me. I need it. I cannot sleep without it. I cannot play without it." Oba's expression softened for a moment, his own heart ringing with conflict. He understood the depth of her attachment, but his fear of superstition, of the village whispers, and of unseen consequences outweighed his sympathy. He knelt to the ground, holding Lila close, brushing tears from her cheeks. "I know it feels cruel, child," he murmured. "I know it seems harsh, but I must do this. Perhaps one day you will understand." Lila shook her head, sobbing, unable to comprehend why the one person who should have been her protector seemed to be taking away her only comfort. With a final, trembling motion, Oba placed the doll in the spade-shaped hole. The earth was cold and heavy beneath it, damp clinging to the doll's small form. He carefully covered Amari with soil, patting it down firmly, and then formed a small mound on top. The last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow on the freshly turned earth, while shadows of the trees stretched across the clearing like long fingers pointing toward the heavens. Lila knelt beside the mound, her hands brushing against the packed soil as if trying to reach through and touch her doll. Her sobs echoed softly, carried by the whispering wind, which seemed to respond with a gentle rustle among the leaves, as though acknowledging her grief. Even after the burial was complete, Lila could not reconcile herself to the loss. She returned to the spot the next morning, tracing the mound with her fingers, whispering the doll's name and pleading for it to be safe. The wind seemed to whisper back faintly, brushing her hair and cheeks as if carrying a secret message. She felt a strange warmth beneath the soil, a pulse that reminded her that Amari was not simply gone, that something more powerful than physical separation might be at play. Oba, meanwhile, returned to the house with a mixture of relief and unease. He believed he had done what was necessary to protect his daughter and the household, yet a small, inexplicable feeling tugged at the edge of his consciousness. Something about the way the forest had been silent, the way the wind had shifted, and the way Lila had clutched at the earth suggested that this act, though meant to teach obedience, might not end as he anticipated. He tried to dismiss the thought, focusing instead on the tasks of daily life, but a lingering sense of anticipation hovered, as though the forest, the wind, and even the shadows themselves were holding their breath. Lila returned to the hut, exhausted and tear-streaked, yet unable to forget her companion. The memory of Amari's bead eyes, the comfort of its tiny stitched hands, and the warmth of its presence lingered in her mind and heart. And though the doll lay beneath the soil, in the darkness of the forest clearing, Lila felt an inexplicable certainty that it was not truly gone. Something told her that Amari, her dearest friend, was waiting, watching, and preparing to respond in ways neither she nor her father could yet understand. In that quiet village, under the gaze of the whispering forest and the stars beginning to emerge, a father's act of discipline had set in motion a chain of events that would awaken magic, defy fear, and test the strength of love. The burial was complete, the doll hidden, yet Lila's bond with Amari remained unbroken, as strong and enduring as the winds that swept across the African plains. Night fell over the quiet village, the sky painted in deep indigos and purples, pierced by the first glimmering stars. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint perfume of blooming night flowers. Inside the modest hut, the house lay in a heavy stillness, broken only by the occasional croak of a frog or the whisper of wind through the thatched roof. Lila lay curled beneath her thin blanket, her small chest rising and falling in rhythmic breaths, her face peaceful despite the sorrow that had filled her heart just hours before. Amari, her beloved doll, no longer rested in her arms. It had been buried in the clearing behind the house, hidden beneath the cold soil by the hand of her father. But as the village sank deeper into sleep, a faint movement stirred in the shadows of the forest. Beneath the blanket of earth, a tiny form shifted. The doll, small yet seemingly alive, had awakened with a purpose that transcended its wooden and cloth frame. Its bead eyes glimmered faintly in the moonlight that filtered through the soil, reflecting a spirit that was patient, loving, and determined. The first whispers of its magic stirred the wind, carrying a ripple of energy toward the village hut. Inside the hut, Oba, Lila's father, sat on a low stool, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He had returned from the burial with a mixture of relief and unease, convinced he had done the right thing, yet unable to shake a gnawing sense that something was not entirely settled. The wind shifted against the walls of the hut, and a soft knocking echoed at the front door. At first, Oba thought it might be an animal, a wandering spirit of the night, or simply the creaking of the old wooden frame. But as the knock came again, softer this time, rhythmic, deliberate, his pulse quickened. "It's nothing," he muttered aloud, though the sound of his own voice betrayed a tremor he did not intend. He rose and peered out into the night, past the dim lantern flickering on the wall. The courtyard was empty, bathed in silver moonlight, shadows stretching long and strange across the packed dirt. No feet, no figures, no movement except for the sway of the trees. And yet, the knocking continued, faint but unmistakable, as if something small, delicate, and purposeful was tapping against the wood. Inside her room, Lila slept undisturbed. Her dreams were filled with bright colors and joyous laughter, a faint echo of the adventures she had imagined with Amari. She did not hear the whispers that floated through the hut, soft and melodic, murmuring words in a tongue older than the village itself. The wind carried voices that seemed to say her name, encouraging her, comforting her, and assuring her that love cannot be buried, cannot be silenced. Oba's unease grew as the sounds persisted. He shook his head and muttered, "I must be imagining it. The girl's grief has filled my mind with shadows." He tried to dismiss the sensation, yet every instinct in his body screamed that the night was alive in ways he could not comprehend. The knocking paused, only to resume in a gentle rhythm, almost playful, like the heartbeat of something familiar but unseen. Little did he know that beneath the earth, Amari had already begun its journey back. Slowly, deliberately, it moved through the soil, guided by the bond of love and the quiet power that resided within it. The first night of separation was not an end, but a beginning. It was a night where the boundaries of the ordinary and the magical blurred, where a father's fear met the unwavering loyalty of a child's heart, and where the spirit of a doll prepared to remind the world that love and devotion can never be truly buried. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, the knocking had ceased, leaving Oba exhausted and puzzled, and Lila still deep in peaceful slumber. Outside, the earth above Amari's resting place seemed to pulse faintly, as if breathing, alive with the promise that tomorrow the story would continue. The next few nights brought a strange tension to the household, subtle yet undeniable. At first it was almost imperceptible. A toy that had been left neatly on the shelf found itself lying on the floor, its small wooden arms stretched toward the corner of the room. A chair, once aligned carefully beside the table, now tilted slightly as if someone, or something, had nudged it during the night. Oba tried to dismiss these occurrences as the result of restless wind or his own imagination, but the frequency and precision of the disturbances began to unsettle him. Every morning, he would notice a small detail out of place, objects rearranged in ways that were too deliberate to be mere chance. One evening, as the moon rose high above the thatched roofs, casting silver light over the courtyard, Oba's unease reached a new level. He sat on the worn stool near the hearth, rubbing his tired eyes, when he noticed something move in the corner of the room. For a fleeting moment, a small figure with bead-like eyes and delicate embroidered clothes seemed to shimmer into view, standing just beyond the reach of the flickering firelight. Oba blinked and it vanished. He shook his head vigorously, trying to convince himself that it was only a trick of shadows. Yet the sensation of being watched remained, a quiet pressure in the air that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. Over the following nights, the signs became more pronounced. The household's objects seemed to move with intention. A small cup would roll slowly across the floor, stopping just short of the edge of the mat. Lila's shoes, once neatly lined, would appear slightly apart, pointing toward the door as if beckoning attention. The lanterns flickered when no breeze stirred, shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls. Oba could not deny the sensation that someone, or something, was observing him, guiding these subtle movements. One night, the moonlight fell directly through the narrow window above the hearth, catching on a small, shimmering surface in the corner of the room. Oba's eyes widened as he realized the glint came from the tiny beads of Amari's eyes. There, just beyond the sofa, a faint silhouette of the doll could be discerned, as though it had been standing quietly, waiting for him to notice. The beads reflected the moonlight like distant stars, casting tiny points of illumination that danced across the floor. Every instinct in him screamed that this was no ordinary doll, no ordinary object. There was life, purpose, and intention embedded in its presence. Oba felt a chill run down his spine as the shadows around the room seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. The wind outside rustled the leaves in the courtyard, but the movement of the objects inside the house could not be attributed to any natural force. Each night, the subtle gestures continued. A drawer left slightly ajar, a small stool nudged closer to the center of the room, a faint brush against the walls as if the doll were walking invisibly, testing its reach. The house itself seemed to hum with anticipation, the wooden beams and mud walls vibrating softly in response to a magic that was ancient, persistent, and protective. Despite his fear, Oba could not bring himself to tell anyone. The villagers would laugh at his account, dismissing it as fanciful superstition. And yet, the truth was undeniable. The spirit of the doll was awake, responding to the love of the girl who had cared for it, moving with deliberate grace to remind its keeper of a promise unbroken. The air felt thicker, charged with energy that seemed to pulse in tandem with the moon, each shift of shadow and glimmer of bead eyes reinforcing the lesson he was slowly beginning to learn. Some bonds are sacred, some loyalties are eternal, and no force, not even anger or fear, could sever the connection between Lila and her beloved Amari. By the end of the seventh night, Oba could not ignore it any longer. The signs were everywhere, impossible to rationalize or dismiss. The doll had returned, not by ordinary means, but through a magic that obeyed only the purity of a child's love. Each movement, each flicker of bead eyes, Each subtle displacement of the objects around him was a testament to a power that demanded respect and careful attention. The realization sank deeply into Oba's mind, leaving him unsettled but attentive, fearful but curious, aware now that the story of Amari was far from over, and that the doll's presence would continue to shape the household in ways he could barely imagine. The next night, the village was wrapped in a heavy blanket of silence. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling leaves in the dim moonlight, carrying with it a subtle foreboding that pressed against the walls of Oba's hut. He awoke abruptly, a chill crawling up his spine, and for a moment he could not recall why his heart raced so violently. Then came the sound, faint, rhythmic, insistent knocking at the door. It was different this time, louder, more deliberate, echoing with a persistence that could not be ignored. Oba sat on the edge of his bed, beads of sweat forming on his brow despite the cool night air. The knocking continued, insistent and purposeful, each tap like the heartbeat of a spirit demanding acknowledgement. He rose slowly, every muscle tense, and approached the door, his hand shaking as it hovered over the rough wooden latch. With a deep breath that trembled in his chest, he pulled it open, expecting, hoping, nothing but empty night. Yet the courtyard was empty, bathed in silver moonlight. No footprints, no shadow, no sign of life. And yet Oba could feel it. The presence was undeniable. A force, small yet overwhelming, pressed against him, filling the air with an energy that was both familiar and alien. It was not wind, nor animal, nor trick of the eye. It was Amari. The doll was there, somewhere just beyond the veil of the visible, moving with intent, infused with the love and loyalty that Lila had invested into it. The bead eyes, so small and delicate, seemed to pierce his conscience, reflecting the quiet yet relentless judgment of innocence betrayed. Oba's mind raced, twisting through thoughts and regrets. He had acted in anger, burying a cherished companion without understanding the depth of its significance. The doll had been a vessel of comfort, protection, and companionship for Lila, a repository of her laughter, courage, and dreams. By burying it, he had attempted to sever that bond, to assert control over what he deemed frivolous or dangerous. Yet here it was, not merely resisting but returning, reminding him that love, care, and devotion are forces beyond human command. The knocking intensified, echoing against the walls with a rhythm that seemed to mimic the beat of his own guilty heart. Oba staggered backward, feeling a pressure in the air, a pull that drew him closer to the doorway even as fear rooted him to the spot. The moonlight caught a glimmer in the corner, and for the briefest moment, he swore he saw a small figure standing there, the beads of its eyes catching the silver light, shining like twin stars. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only a lingering sense of presence that was impossible to ignore. Guilt flooded through him, mixing with fear in a potent, inescapable way. He realized that the doll was not merely an object of play or superstition. It was alive in the only way that mattered, alive in spirit, in love, in the devotion of a child's heart. It carried with it memories of laughter, of comfort in darkness, of protection through storms. By attempting to destroy it, he had provoked a force greater than himself, a force that now held him accountable in silence and subtlety. Oba fell to his knees, his hands gripping the rough wooden doorframe. "Lila, I was wrong," he whispered, voice cracking. The night seemed to respond, a soft rustle of leaves, a faint shimmer along the ground as if the forest itself listened and nodded. The doll had not come to punish him with malice, but to remind him, to confront him with the consequences of fear and misunderstanding. Its presence was gentle yet insistent, patient yet demanding, teaching him that actions rooted in anger and ignorance cannot erase what is sacred. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes and lifetimes simultaneously. Oba remained by the door, humbled, trembling, reflecting on every harsh word he had spoken, every dismissive glance he had cast at Lila and her cherished doll. The knocking subsided, fading into soft taps and whispers, then into the quiet of night once more. Yet the lesson remained, heavy and unshakable. He could not ignore the truth. The doll carried more than memories. It carried the spirit of love and loyalty, a force beyond fear, beyond punishment, beyond human understanding. As dawn approached, painting the village in muted golds and silvers, Oba finally rose. He closed the door slowly, reverently, aware that he had been confronted by a presence that demanded recognition. The house felt different, alive, aware and waiting. Somewhere in the shadows, Amari watched and waited, its silent vigilance a reminder that some bonds cannot be severed, that love and devotion hold power beyond what even the strongest hand can command. That morning Oba would not speak of what had transpired. He would not admit to fear nor to awe. But deep within he knew, the confrontation was not over. The doll's story and its quiet, relentless justice was only just beginning. As the days passed after the mysterious knocking at the door, Lila began to sense that something extraordinary had taken place. Small, subtle signs started appearing around the house, almost imperceptible but impossible for her young, observant eyes to ignore. Tiny footprints, like those of a small child, appeared in the thin layer of dust on the earthen floor. They led from one corner of the hut to another, stopping at places where Lila had once left her doll Amari before it was buried. Each print seemed deliberate, a quiet announcement of presence, a gentle declaration that the doll had returned. At first, Lila whispered to herself, unsure whether it was imagination or reality. "Amari?" she called softly, and sometimes she thought she heard a faint giggle echo in response, delicate and playful as if carried on the evening breeze. The sound was so light, so ephemeral, that she doubted whether anyone else would hear it. But she knew. She had always known the doll was more than mere cloth and beads. In the stillness of the night, she felt the tiny pulse of its spirit, a reassuring warmth that told her Amari had not abandoned her. Lila tried to communicate with her father, hoping to share the wonder and the reassurance of her beloved doll's return. "Father," she said gently one morning, pointing to the footprints that led across the floor, "Amari, she is here." But Oba, still weighed down by pride and the lingering fear of superstition, refused to acknowledge what he could not rationalize. "Child," he replied, voice firm and cautious, "there is nothing here but dust and shadows. Do not let your imagination trouble you." Despite his words, the signs continued, growing stronger and impossible to dismiss. Objects would shift subtly when Lila's back was turned. A toy cup moved an inch closer to the hearth, a small chair tilted slightly as though guided by invisible hands. Even the air seemed charged with a delicate energy, one that made the hair on her arms rise and filled her chest with a mixture of wonder and reassurance. Lila's heart swelled with the certainty that Amari's spirit was indeed present, protecting her and asserting its quiet, magical influence over the household. At night, she would speak softly to the doll, recounting her days, her small victories and her fears. Sometimes she would awaken to find her bed slightly warmer, as if the doll had been near, offering silent comfort. Slowly, Lila realized that Amari's influence was not limited to her own perception. Even Oba, though he stubbornly refused to acknowledge it, felt the subtle shift in the air. A tension that had long existed in the house, the fear, the harshness, the impatience, began to soften, replaced by the unspoken presence of something gentle but powerful, a reminder of love that could not be buried. With each passing day, Lila's awareness deepened. She understood that Amari had returned not only to comfort her but to protect the integrity of their household, to remind her father of the consequences of dismissing love and loyalty. The doll's presence wove through the house like a silent, invisible thread, strengthening bonds, teaching patience and inspiring quiet reverence. Lila felt a growing courage, a certainty that no matter what her father said or did, Amari would continue to watch over them both, a steadfast guardian born from love and innocence. As the days passed after the mysterious knocking at the door, Lila began to sense that something extraordinary had taken place. Small, subtle signs started appearing around the house, almost imperceptible but impossible for her young, observant eyes to ignore. Tiny footprints, like those of a small child, appeared in the thin layer of dust on the earthen floor. They led from one corner of the hut to another, stopping at places where Lila had once left her doll Amari before it was buried. Each print seemed deliberate, a quiet announcement of presence, a gentle declaration that the doll had returned. At first, Lila whispered to herself, unsure whether it was imagination or reality. "Amari?" she called softly, and sometimes she thought she heard a faint giggle echo in response, delicate and playful as if carried on the evening breeze. The sound was so light, so ephemeral, that she doubted whether anyone else would hear it. But she knew. She had always known the doll was more than mere cloth and beads. In the stillness of the night, she felt the tiny pulse of its spirit, a reassuring warmth that told her Amari had not abandoned her. Lila tried to communicate with her father, hoping to share the wonder and the reassurance of her beloved doll's return. "Father," she said gently one morning, pointing to the footprints that led across the floor, "Amari, she is here." But Oba, still weighed down by pride and the lingering fear of superstition, refused to acknowledge what he could not rationalize. "Child," he replied, voice firm and cautious, "there is nothing here but dust and shadows. Do not let your imagination trouble you." Despite his words, the signs continued, growing stronger and impossible to dismiss. Objects would shift subtly when Lila's back was turned. A toy cup moved an inch closer to the hearth, a small chair tilted slightly as though guided by invisible hands. Even the air seemed charged with a delicate energy, one that made the hair on her arms rise and filled her chest with a mixture of wonder and reassurance. Lila's heart swelled with the certainty that Amari's spirit was indeed present, protecting her and asserting its quiet, magical influence over the household. At night, she would speak softly to the doll, recounting her days, her small victories and her fears. Sometimes she would awaken to find her bed slightly warmer, as if the doll had been near, offering silent comfort. Slowly, Lila realized that Amari's influence was not limited to her own perception. Even Oba, though he stubbornly refused to acknowledge it, felt the subtle shift in the air. A tension that had long existed in the house, the fear, the harshness, the impatience, began to soften, replaced by the unspoken presence of something gentle but powerful, a reminder of love that could not be buried. With each passing day, Lila's awareness deepened. She understood that Amari had returned not only to comfort her but to protect the integrity of their household, to remind her father of the consequences of dismissing love and loyalty. The doll's presence wove through the house like a silent, invisible thread, strengthening bonds, teaching patience and inspiring quiet reverence. Lila felt a growing courage, a certainty that no matter what her father said or did, Amari would continue to watch over them both, a steadfast guardian born from love and innocence. The days that followed marked a shift in the household that could no longer be ignored. Oba, once proud and unyielding, began to notice subtle disturbances that made his heart pound with unease. Objects moved without explanation. Small toys that had been neatly arranged on shelves toppled over as if nudged by invisible hands. Doors creaked open on their own, catching him off guard and leaving him fumbling for control. Each event was precise, almost deliberate, as though the house itself had come alive to reflect the unrest of a father who had acted in anger. Lila watched from the corners, eyes wide with wonder and a quiet sense of justice. She understood, more clearly than her father ever could, that Amari was no longer merely a doll but a vessel of protection and moral reckoning. Its tiny form carried a power beyond the human realm, one that could correct wrongs without a word, without malice, and yet with a subtle insistence that demanded acknowledgement. The doll's beads glimmered faintly in the moonlight and sometimes in reflective surfaces, its eyes appeared to glow, casting a watchful, knowing gaze upon the man who had wronged it. It began subtly at first. A cup of water tipped over on its own as Oba reached for it, spilling across the floor and soaking his feet. He muttered to himself, blaming the wind or clumsiness, but the pattern became impossible to dismiss. Small items moved toward Lila's room or away from him, guided by an unseen hand. Mirrors reflected fleeting images of the doll, glowing, alive, and unwavering in its silent admonition. It was as if the house itself had become a stage where Amari enacted lessons of accountability and conscience. One evening as Oba walked past the central courtyard, the wind seemed to stir more vigorously than usual. Toys scattered across the floor, rolling toward him with uncanny precision, forming a path that he could not avoid. Each step he took was met with a subtle but undeniable message. His cruelty, his impatience and his dismissiveness were being witnessed and corrected. The doll's presence was not violent, yet it was insistent, an unyielding force that demanded recognition. Oba's fear deepened as he realized that this was not mere coincidence. He would catch glimpses of movement at the edge of his vision, tiny hands reaching from the shadows, bead eyes sparkling with judgment. The doll's justice was measured, deliberate and almost playful, yet it carried the weight of moral authority. Each mishap, each inexplicable movement, was a reflection of his own failings, mirrored back to him by the spirit of the one he had wronged. Lila observed quietly, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. She knew that Amari's interventions were not merely about punishment, they were lessons meant to awaken understanding. The doll's presence wove through the household like invisible threads of conscience, gently ensnaring her father in reflection and remorse. Even the air felt charged with this unseen energy. The wind carried faint, whispering echoes, almost like a lullaby, telling him to recognize the consequences of his actions. As the days passed, Oba began to falter under the weight of subtle retribution. His sleep was restless, haunted by half-seen movements and glowing eyes in the corner of rooms. He awoke at night to find small items repositioned, reminders of the doll's watchfulness. Each incident etched into his mind the memory of his cruelty, the harsh dismissal of Lila's attachment, and the consequences that even a simple object could carry when filled with love and devotion. Cinematic visions of the doll's power played out in his mind, A toy drum rolling across the floor like a tiny herald of justice, doors opening as if bowing to an unseen authority, mirrors reflecting glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through pride and stubbornness alike. Oba's fear was no longer rooted in superstition but in the undeniable truth of his actions. Remorse settled in his heart like a slow, unyielding tide. He could no longer ignore what he had done or the living presence that had returned to demand recognition. By the end of the week, the household had changed. Oba's voice, once sharp and commanding, softened. His movements were careful, respectful, and cautious around both Lila and the doll that had returned from the earth. He had begun to understand that justice did not always arrive with harsh punishment. Sometimes it was subtle, almost invisible, yet infinitely more effective. And through it all, Amari remained vigilant, tiny, silent, and unyielding in its quiet, magical justice, teaching him the meaning of respect, love, and the power that even a simple doll could wield when born from devotion. Oba spent the following days in quiet reflection, haunted by the unshakable presence of the doll's spirit. The subtle chaos it had wrought, the scattered toys, the moving furniture, the glowing eyes and mirrors, had pierced the walls of his pride and forced him to confront what he had long ignored. He thought about Lila, her laughter, her gentle devotion to Amari, and realized the depth of his mistake. He had acted out of fear, dismissing the power of love and innocence, and in doing so had almost severed the sacred bond between father and daughter. The turning point came one evening as he watched Lila play quietly near the fire, her small hands cradling Amari, or rather the empty space where the doll had been buried. He saw the faint glimmers of magic in the air, the whispers of wind that carried the echoes of her presence, and a deep ache settled in his chest. For the first time he allowed himself to feel genuine remorse, a humility that had long been absent from his heart. He knew the only path to reconciliation was acknowledgement, not words alone but action, tangible, deliberate, and sincere. Before dawn he rose and prepared to make amends. With a small spade in hand and a heart heavy with apology, Oba walked to the spot in the forest where he had buried the doll. The earth felt different beneath his fingers, softer, warmer, almost as if it had anticipated this moment of reconciliation. As he dug, he noticed faint glimmers reflecting in the soil, tiny sparks of magic that seemed to pulse in response to his remorse. With each shovelful removed, his resolve strengthened, and he whispered to himself, "Forgive me, Lila. Forgive my fear and my pride." When he finally unearthed the doll, its beads glimmered faintly in the dim light of dawn, and its embroidered clothes seemed untouched by time or dirt. Oba held Amari carefully, almost reverently, and felt a warm, comforting energy radiate from the small figure. It was as though the doll had waited patiently for this moment, aware of the sincerity in his heart. He turned and walked slowly back to the hut, carrying the doll with the care of one bearing a precious treasure, not just a toy, but a living emblem of love, trust, and reconciliation. Inside the hut, Lila noticed her father approaching with something in his hands. His usual stern expression was replaced with humility and vulnerability. "Lila," he said softly, "I was wrong. I let my fear guide my actions and I buried what you hold dear. I did not understand, but I wish to make this right." He knelt before her, extending Amari toward her. "Please forgive me and may this doll return to your care." Tears welled in Lila's eyes, but they were tears of relief and joy. She took Amari from her father's hands, holding it close to her heart. The energy in the room shifted immediately. The tension that had weighed down the household for weeks seemed to evaporate, replaced by a gentle warmth and the soft glow of reconciliation. Even the air itself seemed lighter, carrying with it a delicate fragrance of flowers from the forest, as if nature itself were celebrating this act of atonement. Oba remained kneeling for a moment, watching his daughter cradle the doll and smile. He felt the weight of his guilt lift, replaced with a profound understanding of responsibility, love, and the unseen forces that guide and protect the innocent. The subtle magic that had been manifesting through Amari, the toys that moved, the whispers, the faint glowing eyes, seemed to recede now, satisfied that justice had been acknowledged and balance restored. Outside the hut, the forest seemed to respond in kind. Birds began to sing, their melodies more vibrant than ever before. Leaves rustled gently, catching the morning sunlight in patterns that danced across the walls of the hut. Even the wind carried a softer tone, no longer a messenger of warning, but a gentle herald of peace. Oba realized that this was the true power of love and acknowledgement. It could heal, restore, and harmonize even when disrupted by fear or pride. From that day forward, the household felt lighter, warmer, and more harmonious. Oba and Lila shared a newfound closeness, a bond strengthened by humility, understanding, and the acknowledgement of unseen forces that guide and protect. Amari remained ever vigilant, not as an instrument of retribution, but as a reminder of the enduring power of love, forgiveness, and respect. The father who had once acted in fear now walked with care, mindful of the hearts he held dear, and forever aware that true strength lies not in dominance, but in compassion and humility.